Hello, so yes, Drew Crawford, I'm an associate professor in the music department here in the humanities, and my project is developing approaches to site-responsive composition, which I'll unpack not on the next slide, but on the slide after that. So just a little bit of, before I get on to that, a little bit brief background on me and why I'm interested in this idea is that after my PhD, or slightly overlapping with it, I spent 20 years working in industry on projects that involve increasingly complex engagements with music production. I define music production as the realization of music as sound. So in contrast to much of the history of Western thought, which thinks of the notated score as being music, really it's about the realization of music as sound. So my training was in that score-based world, and then I moved into this music production world. And in the world of music production, perceived acoustic space is a prime consideration in music production. So any piece of music you've ever listened to on a recording, someone has thought really clearly about how much of the space, the acoustic space, to include either the real acoustic space that was recorded at the same time as the music, or something synthetic that's been introduced afterwards. And in really complex music production, in really complex music productions, there are layers of spaces that could never exist in the real world that are all having an emotional impact on the listener. And we think about it an awful lot. And so sound has become a hugely important compositional consideration for me. And when I moved back into doing more acoustic music, so music for like concert hall, for example, I can't stop thinking about space. I can't stop thinking about the space in which the music has been performed. And that brings me up against this historical reality that this idea of being able to perform music from pretty much any period of time or any place on Earth in the same spaces, like the turn of the century, for example, is a real, it's an anomaly historically. Historically, or culturally, music performance practices grow out of the context in which they exist, obviously, or perhaps not less obviously. You know, so the harpsichord is perfectly designed for a salon in 18th century European salon. African drumming sounds really great outdoors, but it doesn't sound good in a room with walls, or it sounds very, very different, okay, to the way it was intended to sound. So I can't stop thinking about sound, and so one strategy that gets used in new music practice is to use a lot of electronics to try to control an acoustic. But the main problem with that in new music is often they don't have budgets or schedules that allow for really kind of get into grips with how to do that. So there are some really interesting projects that do. But for me, creating site-responsive pieces is one strategy for trying to deal with this. And the way I think about that is the piece is designed to respond to the site in which it's been performed. So it can take into account the acoustic properties of the space. That's in contrast to site-specific, which is for one space only. And there's a kind of a fairly interesting history of site-specific composition over the last 50 or 60 years, everywhere from cathedrals are going to large outdoor spaces that have natural acoustic properties. So when I started working with site-responsive approaches to composition, it immediately started to bring up these other two areas. The first is, I actually start with intermediate composition practices. And by that, what I mean is taking compositional strategies from other media and applying them to music. And in my case, the work that I did in film and television, but mainly theatre and dance, and the way that a choreographer, for example, might make a dance on a company collaboratively using the embodied knowledges of the dancers to create the dance. That's the kind of, I've been interested in that idea for a very, very long time, and using them in my own various ways in lots of different projects. But it becomes really interesting when you're working in a site-responsive way. If you want to really exploit the acoustic of a given performance space, you might need people to move around the room. And so if you're going to do that, then you need to have non-hierarchical models of social musical organisation. That is, rather than having a conductor at the top telling everyone what to do, they've got to be listening for cues from other people. They've got to have other ways of communicating what they're doing. So I'm asking them to move around the space. I'm then starting to think about bodies in space. I'm thinking about choreographic implications, but I'm also asking them to relate to each other in different ways. And that's all a lot of fun. So, the sort of 5 research questions that I am working with on this particular project is how can we develop a language of music in space, space and music with the same sophistication as, for example, harmonic or rhythmic vocabularies? What are the aesthetic and emotional experiences of sound and music in space? What new forms could result when we foreground sound in space as a compositional parameter? What new kinds of skills are needed for performers and composers when engaging in this kind of music making practice? And finally, what are the choreographic implications of spatialising sound in live performance? Now, I have been working on a project for a couple of years now. It's really been slowed down due to the pandemic because, of course, it involves having human beings in rooms together. The first workshop we did was in 2021, where I started, which I'll talk about in a second. And we've done subsequent workshops. But in trying, the project that I'll tell you about in a moment, which I'm working on with the John Hansard Gallery, was always meant to be a pilot project or a proof of concept to set me up for a large AHRC bid. And what we realised is now that I think it was last year they published their updated priorities, and we realised that this question is the one that kind of most closely maps onto the priorities of the UK RI at the moment. That is, health, happiness, well-being, and thriving places. It sometimes feels like a little bit of a stretch, but it is genuinely, if we're asking musicians to do things that they're not trained to do, and I should say too that I don't have time to put my work in detailed context with the rest of new music practice, but this idea of having musicians do things that they weren't trained to do, that's performance things, or playing new types of instruments. There is an emerging trend in this direction. And so, in fact, there's quite large applications beyond just my work into how musicians can engage with performance practice in ways that they've never been taught to. I'll come back to that in a minute. So, the piece that I've called it, we'll find out when we get there, and I'm working with obviously a process of knowledge exchange with the Plus Minus Ensemble, who are a new music ensemble, one of the leading new music ensembles in Europe, and Tim Hand Audio. So Tim does a lot of work at Turner Sims and all over the country. And the idea was to write a piece for gallery spaces because they're reverberant spaces that have a lot of interesting social and cultural connotations, but also they are broadly replicable around the country. So the idea is that I could take a piece that's been written for the Hansard Gallery to respond to that space, and we could adapt it to other spaces that also have multiple. I have no idea how long I'm talking for. I should do that.
You've got 2 minutes.
How many?
2 minutes.
2. Oh, okay. So we did an initial workshop in 2021 that was funded by what was then the Strategic Research Fund. Adam came to that, asked him if you want to know what that was like. There's a picture of Alice playing the cello on a staircase. And it was then a year later that I did another set of workshops, and it was at those workshops, really interesting, where we figured out this idea of the skills, which led to this third one that was published by SIA last year. And we had this. I think I skipped a slide. My bad. There's a slide somewhere. So what came out of the 2022 workshops was how can a musician without theatrical training think about stage movement, particularly movements that aren't familiar, sound-producing ones. Musicians are trained to produce a range of very, very specific sounds without injuring themselves. Okay, that's their training. They're not that, and you actually have, I don't have data on this, so I shouldn't actually say, I probably shouldn't mention this yet, but there are loads of problems in the music industry particularly even in the classical music industry, of musicians who self-medicate because they have no real way of thinking about their body on a stage. They are so anxious and nervous about performance, even though that's their job, right? So how can we, let alone then getting up and walking around the room, okay, to make the sound come from down that staircase. How vulnerable does this make them feel, and how can we make them feel safe? Do they need to think about motivation or character to do this kind of work, or how do they think about their identity or sense of self during performance? And how do they think about their relationship to the audience? And so in order to address some of those questions, we set up this workshop in June of this year, and the CEF funding also managed me to establish the kind of relationship that the team that I want to work with on the AHRC bid. My co-investigator is going to be Associate Professor Erin Brannigan from the University of New South Wales. She's a dance academic, but has a lot of experience working on dance as an intermediate subject, so dance and dance in the gallery, dance and film, and now she's looking at dance and music. Jonathan Burrows is a very important thinker about, he's a choreographer and an important thinker about movement, and he does a lot of work with composers. So we brought him in to work with our musicians, and Dr. Chi Lan, who is a music pedagogy specialist, was part of the team. And so we were able to bring Jonathan Burrows in, which was really fantastic. We learned a bunch of stuff. We're going to be able to premiere the work, and we're going to publish a paper based on the findings of that workshop. Some of those findings include things like the difference between, I realised I made this mistake, there's a difference between technique and practice. So in the way that you might have different meditation techniques, but you have a meditation practice. How can we think about music performance as a practice that addresses all of those questions that I mentioned before? How do we prioritise and deprioritise aspects of levels of performance, decoupling sound and performance? This is a really important one. Musicians are used to understanding exactly what they're doing and how it relates to the larger texture. And when I get them to move around the room, they can no longer tell what they're doing, how what they're doing affects the larger texture. So getting them to become comfortable with that. And also actually looking at distraction techniques. So internal processes for them to get around this problem to help them manage their relationship with the audience and being a body on stage in ways that they are unfamiliar with. That's it.